Welcome back. I'm Gregory Love, and I teach Christian theology here at San Francisco Theological Seminary in San Anselmo, California. And I'm also an ordained Presbyterian pastor, and I love what I do. So what we're doing in this series is we're looking at God's relationship to the human suffering caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're looking at 4 different Christian answers to that question of God and suffering. Last week, we looked at the first of the 4 models. And the first model imagines God as a governor, planning and ruling over all things, including nature and history, and the smallest details of our lives. The 4 reasons for why this governor may bring suffering upon us are these: for some secret part of God's secret plan, or to punish us for our sins, or to train us in righteousness, or to help some third party we may not know about. Today's second model takes the third of those 4 reasons to help to train us in faith and in virtue, and it expands it into its own complete model. So suffering becomes a teaching tool to help us to grow. This second model is also very classic and quite common. And it's clear why it's so. All the world religions say that we are not who we should be, morally or spiritually. Each imagines a way for humans to move from that imperfection to perfection, to grow. So the second model, which imagines God as an artist, shaping us into something beautiful, is ever present in the world and in religions. And is found not only in every religion, but in every theological version along the spectrum of every religion, from liberal to moderate to conservative. To look at this second model, we're going to begin with a liberal view. We'll begin at one of the 2 greatest books on this model, Evil and the God of Love, by philosophical theologian John Hick. Hick begins by offering an alternative to the Augustinian fall story. God created the world for fellowship with God, to freely choose to love God and to love our neighbor. But for God to get this goal, several things are needed, even for the omnipotent God. First, the goal demands that God put us in a world in which God is not obvious. If God were obvious, we would be forced to worship such a magnificent being. So, instead, God put us in a situation in which we are unsure of God's existence. Now, God, who's a spiritual being, did this by creating physicality. God made a physical world, one that runs according to natural laws and chance, and in which those processes are dependable. Now, in such a world where we see the laws and the happenstance, but don't necessarily see God, we are then free to make up our own choice about God, about whether or not we want to have a relationship with God. So, already in this second model, we know that accidents can happen because the world runs by natural laws and chance, and God is not controlling those events. This view of how God makes the world fits what science knows about the Big Bang and evolution and ecosystems of nature, and it also fits what science knows specifically about viruses. Second, the goal of fellowship demands that God make us imperfect and then place us in a stimulating and challenging environment. We're not perfect beings, and this is not Eden. Again, this fits what science knows about us and our world. Early humans lived in a violent and dangerous world, and they themselves were violent and naturally selfish. But we also had the potential to learn, to become loving, and to change our view of God. Early humans lived in a world filled with challenges to our moral, social, and spiritual character. It meant that we could freely choose our path when the road forked, toward virtue or toward vice. The world, it's got natural laws and chance. It's indifferent to us. It provides these moral forks in the road, those choices we get for or against faith. Cars slide off the road according to the laws of physics, and water drowns people, and diseases spread, and they do so indifferent to the lives that they destroy. It is precisely in such situations that the fork in the road appears, and we can choose faith and trust in God and trust in our neighbor, or we can choose mistrust and selfishness like Ebenezer Scrooge when he walks amongst the poor of the city. And so, if God is all-powerful and loves us like a mother loves her own child, then why is there evil? Evil happens because of a physical world that runs on its own laws and provides the right environment for us as humans to grow. In that world, earthquakes and floods happen, and the human body is vulnerable to illness and anxiety. Natural disasters strike by chance with no rhyme or reason, and humans can be evil. God does not intend any of these particular disasters to fall upon us or upon any particular individual. However, God does intend a physical world of natural laws and chance in which such disasters are possible. Because such a world makes human free will possible, and thus God's goal for humans of love makes that possible. Now, this model needs one last piece for it to work. It needs an afterlife. Most people will not finish their growth into fully loving human beings in this lifetime. In the afterlife, they can finish that process of growth. So, God is in the business of crafting souls, but God must engage humans with their free will in order to do it. This view is present in liberal, moderate, and conservative religious forms. In general, the liberal forms see God as allowing natural laws and chance and human free will to take their course, and we simply learn from the events as they appear. The conservative forms see God as causing these challenging events in order to provide us specifically with opportunities to grow. The most significant book on this model is that of a moderate, C.S. Lewis, in his classic book, The Problem of Pain. Lewis wrote this book in 1940 while the Germans were dropping bombs on London daily. In the book, he wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world." Pain is needed to wake us up from our delusions and to get us to turn back to God. Lewis writes, "No doubt pain as God's megaphone is a terrible instrument. It may lead to final and unrepented rebellion. But it gives the only opportunity the bad man can have for amendment. It removes the veil. It plants the flag of truth within the fortress of a rebel soul." So, this view of God as a maker of souls is present in the American view now during this pandemic. Religious people talk about God as shaping us in three basic traits: faith, virtue, and love. So let's take a look at how God uses the pandemic to shape our own relationship with God in our faith. According to Hick and Lewis, God engages our free will, beckoning to deepen us in our faith. And many religious persons believe that God is doing just this. In a recent poll by the University of Chicago Divinity School and the Associated Press, 63% of Americans of all faiths feel that during the pandemic, God is telling humanity to change how it lives. 63% of believers of all faiths. Further, a Pew poll found that 26% of U.S. adults said that their faith has grown stronger during the pandemic. Right? 26%. Only 1% said that it had weakened. If you Google, right, the company Google has found a 50% surge in people searching for prayer across 95 countries, including the relatively secular Northern European countries. Churches have also reported booms in worship virtually, sometimes by a factor of 10. They're getting 10 times as many people as they were prior to the pandemic. Now, the common element is the idea that during the pandemic, God is speaking to humanity to get it to change its ways. The shift in priorities that God is asking for is coming about by God allowing or bringing a pandemic. This is exactly the idea of a God who engages our free will in order to shape our character. Significant Catholic leaders have presented this view. Los Angeles Archbishop Jose Gomez says that God is not the cause of the pandemic, but God does permit it in order to draw good out of it. And what is that good? It gives humans the opportunity to choose love or not to love. There are saints being made in our present crisis, the Archbishop says. Doctors and nurses, mothers and fathers, those who show courage to love their neighbor. These people have that fork in the road to make a moral choice. Last March 27th, Pope Francis said the very same thing. The pandemic is not God's judgment on humanity, but it is God's call on people to change their values. Praying on behalf of the people in Vatican Square, Francis looked up to God and said, "This pandemic is not the time of your judgment, but of our judgment. It is a time to choose what matters and what passes away. It is a time to get our lives back on track with regard to you, O Lord, and in relationship to others." So we've had the opportunity not only to return to God in deeper faith, but also to shape our character in virtue, that second trait. Christine Jeske, a professor of cultural anthropology at Wheaton College, writes that the pandemic can wake us up to see how our methods for securing our identity do not make us happy. As Americans, we are what we do. Our status is gained by our productivity and our resumes. We rely on ever-increasing capitalist growth as a culture. And yet, most of us are afraid of missing out. The pandemic, by bringing our daily lives to a halt, may wake us up to an alternative way to live, one centered in tradition, in relationships, and in God, rather than in production and consumption. Similarly, Mark Tranvik, professor of Lutheran history and theology at Luther Seminary, believes that God is speaking and wants us to listen. The pandemic unmasks the great myth of our self-sufficiency and gives us an opportunity to shift our centers of value onto God. Third, the pandemic also provides us with an opportunity to change our society. So our relationship to our neighbor and that third trait God wants to build in us, love. We have the opportunity to live in solidarity and shared responsibility with our neighbor, Pope Francis said. But this view of the Pope is echoed across the board in other religions. Jeff Levin, an epidemiologist and observant Jew, has studied the relationship between religion and medicine. Just as John Hick described, so Levin has found that in pandemics, people are given the opportunity to display great acts of generosity or acts of barbarous hatred. There's that moral fork in the road. They can show compassion, ethics, and self-sacrifice, but they can also be moved to scapegoating minorities, as happened with the Jews during the Black Plague, and is happening now with Chinese immigrants and Asian Americans. Minorities can be tagged as objects of divine punishment. This view of the pandemic as giving us opportunities to grow is equally present in Judaism and Islam. Rabbi Joshua Kulik of Nashville writes, "I don't see God in the plague. As we learn how the world works, we should know that every now and then viruses come from animals and they can mutate and infect human beings. That's not divine punishment, but the laws of nature. It is in the resilience and the tireless job of those who are trying to come up with a vaccine against the virus that I see God. I see God in the first responders who are risking everything for the sake of other human beings." So, for example, this week, the pharmaceutical companies Pfizer and Moderna have recently declared that they are very close to a vaccine. Pfizer's vaccine is supposedly 90% effective. Moderna, 94% effective. And so Rabbi Kulik would say, that's where I see God at work, in these humans, these scientists, these tireless, courageous efforts to come up with vaccines and also to come up with therapies for those who are hurting. For Rabbi Kulik, God is acting to inspire toward empathy, and God is growing that empathy in us as individuals and as a culture. Also, as we've already seen, 84% of American Muslims believe the pandemic provides a test from Allah to help them grow in their faith. Omar Ritchie of the Islamic Center of Southern California says that the virus is not only a test of faith, but a solidifying agent for faith. Our faith grows in these opportunities of challenge and choice. Further, he says, quote, the Quran says trials will come and we should be prepared for them. So how do we react? Do we go off and hoard toilet paper, he says, or do we take care of others? There's that moral fork in the road. God grows souls, and suffering provides opportunities for such growth, including the suffering during a pandemic.